organized by Faculty of Psychology. Today, we are very honored to have with us our special guest from Australia, an expert in cybersecurity, Professor Monica Whitty. Welcome, Professor Whitty. We're so glad to have you here with us today.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure. Sorry.
Okay. In our first session, Professor Whitty will give a presentation titled Psychology in Hate Speech Phenomenon and Information Flooding. The increasingly widespread and intensive use of technology in recent years has a lot of impacts on our everyday lives. It has helped us tremendously in many ways, but also has its own challenge at times. It almost seems like technology develops faster than humanity can keep up with. One of the challenges it brings is the overflow of information we've received from the internet, in our computer, our smartphones. Even a recent journal from a university in Lithuania stated that nowadays, adolescents are developing more in online settings rather than in offline settings. Digital world has clearly become an integrated and substantial part of our lives. Almost everything is accessible at the tip of our fingers, which could be positive or negative depending on how we use it. On the positive side, on the positive side, the rapid flow of information has led us to new and useful discoveries. But on the negative side, we see many different types of deceptions on the cyber world. The massive amount of false news circulating around, even ones with instilled hatred towards certain people or communities, that could lead to major conflicts among societies, even go as far as igniting riots and harming a lot of people. According to a book about hate speech by Sherin George in 2016, in Indonesia, this phenomenon could be seen during political events where political opportunists exploit the democratic space to mobilize supporters and suppress the opponents, specifically by promoting political agendas that contradict democratic principles. The internet and Google play big roles as well in opening up new opportunities for hate speech phenomenon to become a cross-border issue, making it a very serious threat in our global world and an urgent and important topic to discuss. Fortunately, we have here Professor Whitty, who will share her expertise about this topic. To get to know Professor Whitty better, let's hear a little introduction to Professor Whitty's work.
Professor Monica Whitty. Professor Monica Whitty is the director of University of New South Wales Institute for Cybersecurity, where she also holds a professorship in human factors in cybersecurity. The institute has over 60 members, placing Australia as a leader in conducting excellence in multidisciplinary cybersecurity research, education, innovation, and commercialization. Professor Whitty has personally led large interdisciplinary projects in cybersecurity. Examples include romance scam and scam in general, insider threat, online deception, and cybersecurity practice, education, and awareness raising. She has been a member of the Global Futures Community for Cybersecurity for the World Economic Forum. Professor Whitty is the author of 5 books and over 100 articles.
Thank you. And before we start, allow me to share a few rules of this session. During the presentation, I ask please all the participants to please stay muted. And if anyone have a question, you can write it in the chat box. We will hear presentations from Professor Whitty for 15 minutes and proceed to question and answer session that will last around 30 minutes. Our sponsors and the committee has prepared 2 rewards for 2 best questions. So send us your best question and as many as you can. Ladies and gentlemen, now let me turn it over to Professor Whitty. Professor Whitty, thank you so much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction as well. Very fancy also. Thank you. I'll hopefully be able to share my slides in a second, but what I wanted to talk to you all about today was a little bit going back into history in terms of cyber harassment and bringing that broadly as to how we might understand cyber harassment, and also looking at where we are now with that. And I welcome questions and thoughts at the end, and also, if you think there's issues that you think that might be applied more to your particular culture, that would be interesting as well for me and for me to think about. And the other thing, I guess, to let you know a bit about my background, I am an Australian. I do reside in Australia, work at University of New South Wales now. I actually reside in Melbourne, and so we have had our plenitude of lockdowns, and another one we're in at the moment, number 6. So that's been a challenge in terms of virtual worlds, and I started a job where I moved into lockdown pretty quickly, actually, last year. But prior to that, I actually worked in the UK. So I mention this because some of my work draws from a UK culture and an Australian culture, but then looking at, an Indonesian and other cultures as well, I think it's really important developing our thoughts around that, because harassment is dealt with differently in terms of the legals, and I'm not a legal person, but I can talk a little bit about that, but also what we understand to be inappropriate behaviours too. And so not only do we develop that digitally and understanding our digital worlds, which have happened so fast, but also, what are acceptable ways to behave even within our cultures as well. So let me try to share my screen, hopefully with you all. If I'm lucky, I can do this and this. How does that look? Does that look okay? And I'll get it to that. If it's a problem, do say. Okay, so what I wanted to do was actually, before getting into cyber harassment per se, I wanted to talk a little bit about cyber communication theories altogether. So I am a psychologist, but I'm a multidisciplinary psychologist, and being someone in cybersecurity, it's a very different field again, where you've got many, many, many disciplines. But some of my work draws a bit from media and communications as well. And I'm a big fan, actually, of academics drawing from different theories and not ignoring the great work that's been done by others as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about cyber communication and how we've evolved over time. And one of those issues is, okay, when we first started doing research in this field, we started to think, oh, the internet, the way we communicate, this is so different. This is a complete, revolution in our time, something that we couldn't fathom could happen. And for those of you who are young, the internet's nothing like what you experience today, right? So in our very early days of the internet, everything was in text. There were no bodies present. There were nothing really physical. And if you wanted to see a picture of any sort, it usually required you clicking on the image and hoping it would download, and maybe going back to your computer an hour later to see probably something quite disappointing in front of you, right? So in the early days, theorists, including myself, started to go, right, okay, we have an internet, we have some text here, and we have a new way of communicating. Is there anything that we've done in the past that might be akin to what we are presented with online? And so we have things like the telegraph, for instance, and we have letter writing. And so text as a way to express ourselves from a distance wasn't that new. What was different is that we were able to do this on a bigger scale with more people. And what was different were the people probably that was first starting to use this, because you probably first had your, geeky people that loved computers and wanted to, use technology. So they're a different group in society anyway. And there were people also in that time, but we had this before the internet, wanting to develop relationships online. So when I first started doing research in this field, one of the questions that were proposed to me by my students were, can you really develop a real relationship on the internet? How can that be possible in text with someone you don't know that lives in another country? Can this really be a real phenomena? And so firstly, I went back and went, well, what did we do before? And actually marriages happened over the telegraph, and people wrote romantic letters to each other and waited in anticipation for the next one. And of course, the other thing, besides being text wasn't rapidly sent. So we didn't have our mobile phones to quickly text someone and expect an immediate response and get upset if they didn't respond back. So the rules even of the medium were different as well, and the expectations of that medium were also different. And I find, looking back at all this really, really fascinating, right? We kind of knew we were going to step into a more sophisticated technological world of, bigger, bandwidth and more pictures and whatever. But that accelerated so quickly. And that's interesting, but it causes us problems because developing the norms of how we ought to behave has been quite challenging, I think. So in the early days, one of the things we first really asked ourselves were, can you really develop a real relationship on the internet? Is that actually possible? And so we developed some theories. And as I said to you when we started, that when I first started doing work in this field, I started to look at media and communication theories as well as psychological theories. And I was interested in theories about relationships as well. What do we know about relationships and how they develop over time? So one of the theories coming out in the early days was that, well, no real relationships can happen online because you don't have the social context cues available. You just have a bit of text, and real relationships require a whole lot of other things to communicate in order to know that that's someone you would genuinely like, someone you can trust, someone you can, have a conversation with. Another theory came out with social presence theory, which is a little bit like the context cues, looking at the cues that you give off as in the cues, but social presence is saying, real relationships happens when someone is in your same personal space, because you get to gauge how that person's feeling, thinking, emotions, and you don't get that in text. And so these theories came out suggesting, well, it can't happen because the people in text, you don't even know what they're saying is true. They could be lying to you and making up who they are. Of course, move into 2021, and not only do we know who they are, we know a whole lot more details about people than we ever cared to know before, or that anyone ever cared to let other people know about as well. So there's a lack of traditional social cues online in the early days and a lack of social presence. And the argument was, therefore, it would be an impersonal medium. You couldn't trust people. You couldn't really engage with people properly. Don't bother developing friendships. Don't bother developing relationships. They're insincere. They're not real.
Apologies, Professor Whitty. From our point of view, the slides are not really running at the moment. Are you?
Oh, okay.
You running it?
Oh, okay. Let me do this. There seems to be a resume share, and it's not letting me do that. What I might do is I might stop it and start the share again and see how we go. It says who can share, only the host. Should I change to all participants? Is that the problem, or I might be the host perhaps? Let me try this and see how that works. How's that for you? That looks like a little bit different to me. Is that?
Right now it says presentation of self online. It's on
okay, yeah, so you can see my slides. Brilliant. Oh, fantastic. Honestly, you didn't miss out on much, to be honest. I don't put a lot of text on my slides, as you will see, so I can always do them without, but nice that you've got a few pictures as well, right? Thank you for letting me know that. Yeah, so I guess, so first things I'm talking about, can real relationships happen online? And the argument, no, because people aren't really present with each other. You can't really get to know someone without them having all these nonverbal cues, etc. Okay, and then I guess the other part about a relationship, as you can see on this slide, is looking at the presentation of self online. How do we present ourselves? And in the early days, people were saying, well, you can just be anyone you want. You can present anything you want. No one will know. Just be, somebody else if you wish to. And some people did, right? And some people did. And as the speaker beforehand was saying, sometimes that's healthy, sometimes that's unhealthy, because, deception actually allows in some ways people to open up and present other parts of themselves that they feel comfortable with. And people like Sherry Turkle talked about this and the advantages there. And other people said, well, if you're deceiving everyone online, this can't be genuine or real, and just forget about it. So what did we start learning as researchers started looking at this phenomena of the self online? What we started to learn was actually counter to our early theories about you wouldn't really want to get to know each other, you wouldn't trust each other, that people were self-disclosing an awful lot about themselves in the space. They were opening up about themselves often more than they would with someone in the physical world. And they were doing it quicker as well. So while the early theories were saying not possible, not going to happen, in fact, we found the antithesis happening, that people were really feeling more comfortable to open up about themselves. And perhaps then the lack of physical presence meant that they didn't feel judged and they felt more comfortable to express themselves. Later on down the track, that high-level self-disclosure became a problem in some of the other research that I've looked at, for instance, at romance scams. So romance scams are people that a victim that thinks that they've met someone online that they feel comfortable with, and they feel, you know, they could fall in love with them, and they just self-disclose an awful lot about themselves. And of course, when we self-disclose, we're actually developing trust with another person. We only self-disclose when we want to get closer to someone, and then this self-disclosure happens both ways, right? We also, theorists talked about this idea of a stranger on the train phenomenon. And what that theory meant is that just like people meeting on a train and never meeting again, you're more likely to open up. So there were these theories about, you know, okay, well, if you're not going to see them again, you get in a taxi, you can tell things about yourself that might be shameful even. That will be okay because they're never going to see you, and you're not accountable for those actions again. And the stranger on the train phenomena was actually named after a Hitchcock film where two people planned a murder, and they, you know, met on a train and they went off their ways and never saw each other again, and they murdered the other person's victim that they wanted to do. So this is where the actual term comes from. I also found in the early days that people were able to flirt online too, and so that was counter to what people were saying, look, you know, when you flirt and you're developing a relationship and you start doing that, then what normally happens is you need a whole lot of the body present. So how can you do this when it's just text? Again, just talking about a world when we just had text. And what we found is that people compensated, and they compensated by writing acronyms that might express themselves, and developing in text at that time what we now know to be emoticons. And of course, now we have a whole plethora of these things, right? We've got memes, we've got, you know, all sorts of fancy ways to express emotions. And we do this in meetings, we do this all the time. And so it's so interesting to me going back to those early days where they thought there was no hope for relating online in any way and being close and feeling warm with others. Thank goodness we moved on in a time when we're in COVID, where we can do some of these things, because then it helps us feel less lonely in many ways, right, as well. So while there were the negatives to start with, and the negatives still, and I'll talk a bit about those, it's also good to reflect on how technology has made our life much better in many ways too, and can continue to do so. So hence I was finding these things, which at the time were seen as quite radical views because people thought that can't be possible. But we found, no, we actually can experience love online, we can develop relationships, we just compensate. And so then this question of looking at our true selves online became an issue. And what did we mean by this? So John Barr and Caitlin McKenna were some of the theorists that actually started to look at this idea that, okay, if we can present a self online, what might that self look like? Is that self a genuine self? Is that self just a playful self? And we had Sherry Turkle talk about the idea of playing online and playing with identity. And what John Barr and Caitlin McKenna, coming from psychology, talked about was looking at, well, there could be a true self presented online and an actual self presented online. And what they meant by that was actually the true self is the traits or characteristics that individuals possess, and would like to, but are not usually able to possess. So the idea of Carl Rogers, for instance, and I'm assuming a lot of you might know of Carl Rogers' work, and Carl Rogers talked about the self as actually something that's quite precious, in the way, I guess, that, you know, people before him talked about the ego with psychodynamic theory, that you don't just tell everyone all your innermost thoughts and your innermost identity. You slowly reveal that to people. So that's one way of presenting the self. The other self is the actual self, according to their, you know, drawing from Rogers' theory. The actual self is traits or characteristics that individuals possess and express to others in social settings. Now, what these colleagues found was actually that people were able to present the true self online, and that they also found, and others replicated this, that people who were socially anxious were more likely to do this than they were in the physical world. So what they found then was that the internet and our communications online offered us a new space to be able to reveal who we are in a comfortable way that wasn't feeling as judged perhaps as before. So it was really quite a positive thing in many ways. So while, you know, we might be worried about the types of ways we might, you know, reconstruct ourselves, they were finding this was a great opportunity for people. And so looking at seeking out the true self online, what researchers were finding is that people were able to do that. And Joe Walter, which I don't think I've unfortunately created a slide for, what Joe talked about and still talks about today is the hyperpersonal self. And the hyperpersonal self, this comes from communications theory, but it's very useful in psychology as well, I feel. It's the idea that you're presenting something even more detailed, even more revolutionary about yourself in this space than you could ever achieve in the physical world. And he said that you got to do that very, very, very quickly as well, much more quickly. So you could get more intimate online with others than you could in the physical world. So when we started, I talked about the idea, social context cues and social presence theory said, no way, not going to happen. And as we studied this and learnt how people could communicate, we found the opposite happening, that actually presented new opportunities. Now, what I also found in my research, before I got into the cybersecurity area of things, is looking at dating sites and how did they work, right? And of course, we still have dating sites today, but people also use other platforms like Facebook and other places to develop relationships. And in the early days of this, people were only using dating sites really as a last resort. They couldn't find a relationship in any other way. This is the only place left for me to find someone. It was kind of the view in those days. And what was happening there too is that they were probably more middle-aged than older individuals. In fact, in the early days, it was mostly men as well. So men were really populating the sites, and the sites were saying for women, you can get on there for free. Men, you have to recharge. But we need more women to match up with the men on these sites. So that's what was happening in those days. And we found actually on these sites that something happened a little bit different, that actually people were deliberately trying to think about how am I going to construct myself in a way that I give a snapshot view and reveal something about me that somebody else might like. And so that was really quite challenging for people, because they were thinking, I want to be attractive to as many people as I can, but I want to show a little bit about myself too, because I want to find the right partner. So how did that work out? Well, it hadn't worked out completely great for people, but the mediums evolved, and that's because the norms that happen in those those spaces have changed a bit too. So people, I described them as shoppers online when they were using these sites, because they're shopping for someone that they ideally want, and they're trying to create a great product that people might buy into as well. And it was a snapshot in some ways of depth and breadth. And that's quite challenging, because if you think about the way your relationships evolve, even with the internet these days, you don't tell everyone everything about yourself the first time you meet them, or on a site before you even have met them. So how does self-disclosure work? So how we develop with self-disclosure can change, not just because of the way the internet might have been in those days, but also the objective of that space as well. So it makes it a little bit more complicated, right? What I was also finding that people were lying online, and perhaps that's not surprising because you could, disguise yourself in many ways. But then we found that there were kind of norms about how they might lie, and how they might lie on a dating site, and how they might lie in other spaces as well. Bearing in mind that research has found, including my own, that people lie every day, right? They're just not necessarily malicious and over the top lies, but they might be lies, just to make people feel better about themselves. But when it came to dating sites, the men were lying about how tall they were, their socioeconomic class, so whether or not they had a great job, whether or not they were earning a lot of money. And women were lying about how thin they were and their age as well. And they'd use a younger picture of themselves too. So, this is where we were presented with. And for those of you that weren't around in those days or using the internet terribly much, this is probably a bit of a different world to the world that you're experiencing now. So let's step into the COVID era now. So we're talking about text and how people wanted to develop relationships, and how great we could actually use text to be able to express ourselves and our true selves. And now we're in the COVID era, and we've got all this wonderful bandwidth, and we can do so much that we couldn't do back then. And guess what? We don't all want it so much, right? In fact, probably as you're listening to this in a long talk, having to watch a computer is a challenge. So, it's a challenge in the sense that, well, we got what we wished for. We wanted more bandwidth. We wanted to see people, but now we want to turn it back a bit, and we go, oh, maybe just an email could have sent that message rather than a half an hour Zoom chat. So it's just so interesting. I love humans for this reason, that, we always constantly surprise ourselves with what we want and what we can achieve. So I think the norms about, because the internet has evolved so fast and we could do all these things, we haven't really established the norms about what works best in how we relate, and what works best in the workforce as well. So, I've got this cartoon up here about, it's my support group for Zoom fatigue syndrome. Now, I've had a read about, Zoom fatigue syndrome, and it's a thing, right? And so why is it a thing? One, for the reasons that I've just said already, that, sometimes we could just do it in an email, and yet we've got this competing need that everyone's been in lockdowns, they can't get out of lockdowns, they miss people, they want to relate to people, but then they don't want to relate that much to people. So we've kind of got this juxtaposition. Zoom fatigue syndrome is a bit more than that, though, and this is where psychology comes in. That's really important as well. So what do we do that's different in a physical meeting than perhaps in a Zoom meeting, even if it was taking the same amount of time? So let me tell you, if you haven't already thought about these before, which you probably have. So, okay, in a Zoom meeting, are we replacing like with like? We've got all these people in a room, and we can see their faces sometimes, and we can, look at their reactions. But do we do that in the physical world? We do, but we don't do it to that extent, actually. If you think about it, I thought this picture kind of shows it. We're looking all over the place. We're being distracted by things. We're thinking about other things. We might be texting away, doing another conversation, and we're not having to seek out, the communication on people's faces. We're not having to, try and concentrate on all the words being said, and it being expected to behave a certain way with your camera on. And then if things are getting too much, you might go out of the room. You might have already gone out of the room now, to make a cup of tea, to have, I need to switch off for a little bit, because there is a lot of concentration, and it's a different way of communicating that we're not used to. And I think that's really something important to understand about that. And I just thought this background is really important to understand, to put then the question of cyber harassment into play here, that, what we do is in some ways similar to the physical world, what we were doing, but in some ways different. And I think we just need to acknowledge that as well. So I'm going to move on to talking about the cyber harassment parts of the talk now. Now, what we find is cyber harassment is definitely on the increase. In 2015, some academics in Australia reported in their ways of sampling, at least, that 60% of the adult Australians reported some form of digital harassment or abuse. But of course, it all depends on how you might define harassment as well, right? And I think that's really important. And we can define it differently if we're a psychologist, but also differently according to the law. And not everyone is in consensus here. Just as an aside, in some other research I was looking at in terms of stalking, in COVID, at least in the UK, when stalking in terms of the physical stalking actually increased. So while we had the internet as a way to stalk and all the rest, if people fancy doing that, people were actually walking around stalking at people's houses because they knew they were in, they knew where they were located. And of course, we can find more information of people online as well. So what do we mean by harassment anyway? Well, harassment can mean intimidating speech to make people frightened, to do this intentionally, to bully someone. It can mean stalking, looking up information about someone. It could be finding unkind things about people and populating that online. It could involve sexting, it could involve trolling. And sometimes these things are harassment and sometimes they aren't. So it's not so easy to define at all. And of course, what's really important for us to know is that even the term stalking, as in a legal term, was only introduced to the world in 1990 in California. That's the first time we even considered that as an illegal act, right? And that was in response to Rebecca Schaefer in the slide here, who was murdered by her stalker. So, you know, stalkers may stalk individuals because they are someone that they want to have a relationship with or believe they ought to, you know, be in their world. And so they often, and still do, stalk celebrities, believing, you know, that celebrity really wants to have a relationship with me. But it can go to just ordinary lives too, of people wanting to develop a relationship of some sorts. But stalking can be a lot more than that. It can be about relationships, but it also can be about wanting to cause upset to someone, wanting to frighten someone, and wanting to cause upset to an organization too. It can go that broadly. So I want to share some definitions with you about how might we define stalking, and also to demonstrate it's not so easy to really go about knowing this either. So here's a definition by Boji, who was an UK student actually, who did some work on stalking some years ago, but I found the definition quite useful. He writes that stalking is a group of behaviors in which an individual, group of individuals or organizations, and I should say he was referring to digital stalking, uses information and communications technology to harass another individual, group of individuals or organizations. Such behaviors may include, but are not limited to, the transmission of threats and false accusations, identity theft, damage to data or equipment, computer monitoring, solicitation of minors for sexual purposes, and any form of aggression. Harassment is defined as a course of action that a reasonable person in possession of the same information would think causes another reasonable person to suffer emotional distress. Now, I emphasize when I say reasonable person, because there are laws that have been developed around this idea of a reasonable person test. What would a reasonable person think is intimidating behavior? That's really hard to define. So I'm glad I'm not a lawyer, because that's not such an easy thing to define. And so other places have defined it differently to perhaps a reasonable person's test. But then we get the problem. Stalking can happen across, you know, places, right? It can happen across countries. It can happen across states. And so how do we deal with that legally? And who deals with that as well? Again, that's a little bit beyond my presentation being a psychologist, but it's useful to point these things out. So we have the England and Wales Act as another example, and this is the law. It talks about reasonable person. So in their definition legally, a person must not pursue a course of conduct which amounts to the harassment of another person. No intent is required. So that's really interesting. You don't even have to intend to cause harm for it to be harassment. Instead, the reasonable person test is used, qualified in the act by the words in possession of the same information. The offense of causing harassment is unusual in that it is not always to prove that a person actually knew the conduct amounted to harassment. The mental element in harassment is established on proof that the suspect knew or ought to have known that the conduct amounted to harassment. Its effects upon the victim determine whether a course of conduct amounts to harassment. The advantage to this is that any persistent unwanted behavior can amount to harassment. So this is interesting, right? It's saying that, well, you know what, you don't even have to intend to do it, and we can still call this stalking or harassment. Now, look at another definition, and this is in South Australia. So in Australia, we're a bit different in the sense that we have states that can have laws of their own, right? That makes it even more complicated, I think. But in South Australia, which is an early one to develop the law, they say that where stalkers take advantage of information technology, either to cause physical or mental harm to the victim, or to cause the victim to feel serious apprehension or fear. Cyber stalking occurs when a person on at least two separate occasions, so it has to happen more than once, according to South Australian law, with an intent to cause serious harm, uses the internet or some other form of electronic communication to publish or transmit offensive material, or communicates with the person or others about that person in a manner that could reasonably be expected to arouse apprehension or fear. So we'd still have the word reasonable there, but what we do have that's different is intention, and also the fact that it has to happen more than once, according to this law. So I find that quite interesting when we're comparing these across. So what is cyberstalking then? So this keeps changing, I think, with the technology, but broadly, it's any electronic communication device that can be used in cyberstalking. And experts in this area these days would say it's very hard to have stalking without cyber element in some form or another, even if it's to enable people to find someone or locate someone, right? Even if it's not used to do the harassing communication. So in the early days, one would say that it can be accompanied by traditional forms of stalking and harassment. And today, I would say, as I said already, it would be very hard for it not to. There can be, though, examples where stalking in terms of cyber stalking might happen without any physical element at all. And so to give this example here, this person sent text to a 16-year-old more than 170 times and offered her cash to become his sugar baby. As you can see here in the slide. So Daniel Stone, 48, admitted to sending the text messages to a teenage girl over a 4-day period. And this was in America, I believe. In his text, Stone of Solemn pretended to be someone else and offered the girl cash and other goodies. Many of the text messages indicated that Stone was watching the girl and was familiar with his home. So as you can see here, these messages are clearly set to intimidate. And yet, what I will say too, in the early days of cyber stalking, where you can see that this can cause real intimidation and real harm, police weren't reacting terribly well to this. And that was what I was learning in both Australia and the UK at least, and to part in America as well. In fact, common advice from police in the early days, and in the early days wasn't that too long ago, was just turn off your computer. You'll be all right. Just turn off your computer and then you don't have to deal with it anymore. Turn it off. Now, obviously that's not great advice. And can you imagine if that advice was given to us today how could we even live our lives right now without them? So very hard to imagine. Of course, you know, that was the day before smartphones, etc. But nonetheless, I guess the point is that police were treating it as something trivial. And it kind of goes back to what I started the talk today saying, you know, the idea of text is not real communication. Real relationships can't form there. And if real relationships can't form there, people can't really be harmed, right? So this is kind of where the thought was going. Now, you had the other extreme where people were talking about if you're in a virtual environment, and probably people have heard of the Lambda Moose stories about a rape that happened in cyberspace, but these were between characters in a game, right? And the question of, could that be real harassment? And I don't have the answers for all these questions, but that was something that was really debated at that time. You know, if you're attached to that character, you feel like it's a part of you, going back to the McKenna stuff, if this character still represents a bit of me, perhaps that's harm to me as well. And you know what, if you look at this today, perhaps in its less severe form, but you see kids playing on their, you know, little games online with their little avatars. They become quite attached to their avatars, even though they don't look anything like them, but they relate to them through them. And so if people talk to them unkindly in that space, or to their avatar in that space, it feels like it's talking to them. And I guess, you know, that again, bringing in the early days of communication and how we even communicate in text today has an impact on our lives. Okay, and other forms of cyberstalking, going back to Zoom now, is Zoom bombing. I've actually personally not experienced Zoom bombing yet, so I hope to not experience that. But it has become a popular thing even in education systems, where people will troll by jumping into unexpectedly into a Zoom meeting and uninvited as well. And they may say things to try and derail the conversation and upset people in a trolling form. So going back to looking at all of this, what I'm arguing is that, you know, cyberstalking isn't a trivial crime. And I think we're probably bought into that by now. Cyber can enable stalking, but it also is stalking as well. And in the way that we talk about hyper-real relationships and hyper-intimate relationships, the other thing that wasn't talked about, and perhaps needs to be talked about a little bit more, is that these stalking experiences might seem hyper-real. In other words, in the same way that Joe Walter talked about hyper-intimate relationships, this might have a stronger effect on individuals. So why might it have a stronger effect? It might have a stronger effect because it's a recordable medium. You see it and you read it and you read it in the same way as hyper-personal relationships happen. And so that hatred and animosity towards someone becomes even more tangible, even more real, and it doesn't flow away from you. So I think beyond the trivial, I think we've moved to something that's potentially a much more serious crime. Besides obviously death, you know, death's not a good one. That's obviously serious, but not all stalking involves death. And also the threat of being killed is still very much a reality for people who are stalked online. So I've got a quote here by some wonderful theorists in terms of stalking, including Lorraine Sheridan, who is a hero of mine in the area. And the quote says, looking at the psychological impact, that cyberstalkers can negatively impact the health, carers, friendships, and finances of their victims, and can develop into offline physical abuse. And I think what these researchers have talked about that's really important, besides all the other wonderful things they talk about, is that it impacts others in our lives as well. It's not just the individual, it's the individual's partners, it's their family, it's their friendships, etc. And I've heard, you know, victims talk about their stalking experience years later as if it's still fresh to them, that it still impacts them years later when it's all finished, right? So it's definitely a serious crime. So who are the people who are more likely to be stalked then when we're looking at stalking and we're looking at, in particular, cyber stalking, although the two are often the same? We find that students are a high population of victims in terms of stalking. And there's probably a couple of reasons for that. Probably because, as we've talked about before, and we've got here on the slide, obsessional relationships, is what Spitzberg talks about. Cyber stalking kind of overlaps with that. That students are in a younger age group where they're looking for relationships. They're amongst other people, and so those people can get together and know each other. And so then that they are found to be more likely to be a stalked population. Victims are also more likely to be women. There's still not a lot known about the profile, a lot more needs to be done. But what I think is interesting is that researchers like Lorraine Sheridan have found that they're often repeat victims as well. So they've been hit once by stalking from one person, and then they become stalked again. So then the question is, why might that be the case? So who are the criminals or offenders? And in some ways, sometimes, you know, it's that fine line between an offender and not. But who do they tend to be? They tend to be males, but not always necessarily. And I think that's really important to understand. Females can be and have been stalkers and harassers. They may have experienced a traumatic childhood. Some research suggests that. They may have drug and alcohol problems, and they may have a narcissistic personality. But just like with a lot of things, and I'm sure you'll all appreciate, there's a lot of variance in all of this. So I think it's really, you need to be careful about how you profile these things when you have so much variance involved, right? In terms of another issue that also goes on this border between sometimes people having fun, sometimes it being a criminal act, is looking at the term sexting. So, as I say, some people are doing it for fun, but then for some, it turns out to be starting to be fun, but not. Depending on the age group, that it can be a crime. But I think it goes back to where I've talked about before, besides the fact that it may be fun for people, it's a recordable medium, and that recordable medium can be posted to others. And while people might think that they're in a very private, anonymous world, even with pictures and everything else, the internet's open to people exploiting others and sending that material off, and they can do so very, very quickly. So here's another form of harassment I just wanted to mention, given, you know, our new worlds of technology and how we might actually deal with all this too. To give a quote from Gasso et al. In regards to sexting, they say, although consensual sexting is not prima facie a crime, as some research has shown, it has the potential to be a risky behavior and a threshold to get exposure to dangerous kinds of victimization as sextortion, online grooming, or cyberbullying. In this context, teenagers represent a vulnerable group due to their limited ability of self-regulation, their high susceptibility to peer pressure, their technophilia, and their growing sexual curiosity. And see, that last point, I think, is a really, really important point, coming again from psychology, that this is a phase where people are developing, exploring relationships, but also exploring their own sexuality. Who am I in this world? How do I learn about these things? And so they might lead to these kind of opportunities to be able to explore themselves in this way, in a sense with curiosity. And in some ways, you want to afford those opportunities in order to be able to, in order to be able to help the developmental path of young people. But in this type of environment, it's actually quite a frightening environment for people, and it's not a healthy environment. So it might be that beyond the law, and I think that's why this quote is quite important, you know, the law can deal with some things, but we have to develop norms and expectations about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, right? So moving along, trolling, another issue that we have in terms of harassment and bad behavior. And trolling is broadly defined as an activity that involves a user or groups of users who is or are often anonymous and communicate in online spaces. But being anonymous isn't always the case, with the intention to have an impact on other users. And we have some famous trollers out there these days that really go for trying to cause harm to others. And when you see that harm, again, being a recordable medium, that harm really sticks and is really awful for people to try and deal with. Trolls are often referred to as wishing to incite conflict. So they are really the people with that intent. And actually, in the definition, we would understand them as getting pleasure out of doing that as well. That actually, that if they get a response, they've done their job, they're happy for having caused this. However, they are also understood to communicate to make a point, e.g. a political point for their own pleasure. So sometimes trollers might be described as not trying to cause harm to individuals, but really trying to drive home their left wing or their right wing views. So how do we deal with trolls? Well, the advice has been a little bit like the police saying in the early days, turn off your computer, you don't have to worry about it. The argument would be, don't feed the trolls. In other words, don't buy into them trying to intimidate you and ignore their arguments when they try to incite things. Now, that's not so easily clear cut, right? And it's not so easily clear cut because you still want to be able to have a conversation, still want to be able to enjoy those conversations. And so therefore it's quite a challenge if one is not able to do that. So I'm getting towards the end of my talk now and just want to talk to one more point and then wrap this up. So we've looked at all this and, the advice we might give to people who are trolled or people who are harassed. And I think we need to be careful. There are certain things that we can say to protect individuals. And I think that's really important, right? Which technology to use, how to go about using things in a safe way. So like we talked about, sexting and the problems that lie in doing that. And perhaps, be precautionary and not do these things. But when they are done, victims aren't to blame for communicating in these particular forms. It is the criminal, the offender, that has caused the harm that is to blame. So while we may want to find solutions, and there are numerous solutions we might find to protect victims, we need to be careful within that we're not blaming them for what's happened. And as we move into a world of digital technology, where we're actually getting much better at using, developing tools, one of the things that can be done and has been done to some extent with some types of communication is trying to screen out that communication and trying to screen that out automatically. So in the early days with online groups, for instance, you had moderators, and you still do, to be honest, watching the communication and going, if there's bad communication, you'll take it out. Even with these things like Zoom, for instance, you often have someone watching the chat, and if there's something coming out that's not, kind comment, defamatory, whatever, perhaps a troll comes in, then you delete that chat yourself. But of course, with the technology of AI developing and deepfakes developing, there are other new ways to be able to detect without having the human there necessarily. And why that technology, moving that forward, is so important is because even the moderators are affected by having to look at this type of material. So if you speak to moderators, and there's some good research done there, but how were they impacted from having to moderate and bring out, delete, awful information that might be happening in groups? They actually need therapy afterwards, and even police find that quite challenging, right? So, there are ways that we can use technology to be able to help develop this and create safer spaces. But I think we need to define those spaces a little bit more and what's appropriate. So for instance, going back to Zoom that I was talking about earlier, and Zoom fatigue, and how we might use this technology at work. I'm sure it's probably the case for a lot of you. As soon as going into lockdown, everyone wanted to get onto all these teleconferencing forums to relate. But no one kind of thought is that a healthy thing for us? Is that psychologically healthy or not? And where should the rules be? What should our employers be suggesting as healthy ways moving forward? And you know, that goes beyond just the protecting people from harassment. It's also about protecting people psychologically from how we communicate effectively, and taking up our time, right? And for someone that has been doing homeschooling now for a long time, I can vouch that, you know, we need to do things better, how we balance our times, and how our employers need to be a bit more understanding there as well. So my conclusions then, from looking at the physical to the cyber, what's changed and what's remained the same? We started with text. We still use text to some degree. And in fact, one thing I didn't mention is that often young people, instead of making a phone call, will text someone and would think the idea of making a phone call is ridiculous. But at the same time, we have all this, you know, teleconference modes to bring us together as well. And yet, in our early days, when we thought we couldn't develop relationships online, even in text, we found that we could, and we could do it in a different way to the physical world, and in some ways a closer way, which to some has benefited, but to others has caused harm, or hasn't been a healthy way to develop relationships. I think we've got a big journey still ahead of us. It's not just about the technology changing and the affordances that it has for us, but it's also about what are the rules that we think, perhaps as psychologists and other disciplines, that we might need to advise in policy, and just suggestions on way forwards to use this technology in a way that causes us more benefits than it does harms. And I will conclude there.
Thank you so much, Professor Whitty, for the presentation. It's very insightful and very useful information. I think we all can take advantage of the presentation. A few points that stood out for me is that, let me rephrase it again, and please let me know if I understand this right, that it's actually possible to build a real relationship on the internet, in contrary of what we thought before, that it was not real because it's all virtual and we cannot see the real person, right? And unfortunately, yes, there are some negative side of the internet, which is still different in each areas, how it's regulated. Like, for example, I would say in Indonesia, trolling is not very much seen as a crime. But maybe later somebody could share more about this. And it's also very different in the US. If I could share my experience in the US, where freedom of speech is highly regarded as like a really a big value there in the US. So anyone can say what they want. So it's also very difficult to see which one is trolling or which one is just stating their opinion. So I think this makes it tricky for the law enforcement to see, like, if they want to act on it. Yeah.
Oh gosh, absolutely. That is such a wonderful observation. You know, in America, the idea that, you know, you shouldn't censor people, right? It's a right to be able to express yourself. And then in other countries like the UK and Australia, saying, look, you know, if your expression is going to cause harm to others, then it can't happen, right? And then with trolling, you know, in some instances it will fit the law where you're saying that you shouldn't, it is a harassment charge. But in other cases, the trolling may be, as I was saying before, like political as well. I guess the other thing too, to think about in all this, with our technology and the way we communicate, often there isn't that time for reflection either. So when we blurt out something in a text and we express ourselves in these ways, people can do it quite impulsively without thought, and then it's done, right? And it's sent out there, and it's too late to retract in some ways as well, or more challenging too. So I think that's something that's a little bit different as well. I mean, in the early days, we also talked about being synchronous versus asynchronous, right? The idea that, and text messages can still be like that, that you send a text, it's not in real time, And so the way you respond is going to be different. And everything happening on the internet in the early days was a bit like that anyway. But now we have it asynchronous. And recorded. So it is really, really different. But I like your comment about looking at those cultural differences and what is acceptable versus not. I learnt years ago when I was teaching some students in the UK, I had an Indonesian student there, and we were looking at this wonderful paper about how many numbers of friends you have on Facebook. And some of you might know about Robin Dunbar's work and social networking and Dunbar's number of 150. And if you start going over 150 with your number of friendships, then they're insincere, they're not real, right? And this is going back a few years, so the world's changed again, etc. But I remember the Indonesian girl saying, no, if you have those few, that means you don't have any friends. We do things differently, right? And I think what it goes to show is that even with technology like this, there are different understandings, and often the theories are developed by people with a cultural lens. And Robin Dunbar, he's a great academic, but he comes from looking at the animal kingdom and how the animals relate. I've been on a debating team with him actually, where with Oxford, and how we looked at, is it healthy, is it not healthy having too many friends online? And he would say, no, it's not. But the other view is that your friendships do different things. And I think this is what this student was saying, that, her friendships weren't insincere, that they provided different types of support that people, perhaps in the Western world, like the UK, weren't using it in that way, right?
Yeah, I think also the point that makes it even more tricky is if you have to prove the intent of the perpetrator, because this is, who has the tools to check their intentions at that time, right?
Exactly. That's such a good point. And I guess, and I'm not a lawyer to do lawyer speech, but looking at motivations, intent, I think that's a tough one. And so I can understand why people might put into the law, whatever a reasonable person would think rather than intention. Then there's the idea of having it do on more than one occasion. It is tough. When I have looked at cyber stalking cases, so it's pretty obvious when it's a cyber stalking case. So looking at it from, psychological angle and what might be inappropriate versus illegal, but the law has to cover it in some ways. And then the law, people can get out of it if, you're looking at this with intention versus not as well, right? I doubt very much if anyone would be prosecuted with someone that was saying, was genuinely not doing it intentionally, because the stuff you see is just so obviously vile, if that makes sense. Yeah. But still tricky.
Yeah, it is true. If it's repeatedly, especially on your example, it was 170 texts to someone, and it has to be, something has to be like going on there.
Exactly. There can be no doubt, right? And it's in part that repetition is what's intimidating as well. You can get one message that's really horrible and threatening and say, I'm going to get you, and that might be enough, I'm going to kill you, whatever. That may be enough, by some legal standards. And boy, I'd be frightened if someone wrote something like that to me. And then the repetition of, other things, it's, yeah. And then I guess you've got that legal issue, and then you've got the other issue that's in between. If you did a Venn diagram, right, of going, this is okay, this is not okay, and what's in between is the in between part of this is inappropriate behavior, and having maybe to say to people, don't communicate in that way. You are causing upset. Can you understand this? Versus, no, get away from people. This is totally illegal. That makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. So here we have already few questions. Let me call one. Mr. Endro Puspawiroko is asking. Maybe we can let Mr. Endro Puspawiroko to ask by himself. Or should I read it?
I don't mind either way.
Okay, let me just read it then. Hi, Professor Whitty. I'm Kenya Puspita Wardhani, full-time lecturer and researcher in Faculty of Psychology, Universitas Pancasila. Currently, I also work as an HR consultant, helping my clients to recruit and select candidates. One of the popular methods in employee selection nowadays is evaluating the candidates based on their social media profile. In your opinion, is this method really allowed or permitted? Looking forward to hearing your answer. Thank you.
That's a great question, and I think it's a cultural issue as well. Like in Australia, I don't think you would be allowed to do that. I'm not even sure people normally would do that, but maybe it's different according to different jobs. But as psychologists, let's look at this a different way, this question. Is it valid? The information you present on that line, is it a valid measure of who someone is? And it might be, right? And perhaps maybe we look at what forums is acceptable to look at. If we would say in the art of the possible, yes, you should be able to look at media profiles. Should we be looking at Facebook? Should we be looking at LinkedIn? LinkedIn is known as more of a norm to communicate about careers versus Facebook, which is a friendly environment potentially. I know I've seen cases of Insider where they they showed data on their social networking profiles. And I tell you what, if they looked at that at the time, they would have seen they've been doing something wrong in their organization. So this is something, I don't know the laws regarding this or even the culture. So they're interesting questions, but I guess we need to look at this in two ways. What's culturally acceptable, but also, even if it's culturally acceptable, does it yield information that's useful for us to provide more information about someone? And it might, right? Because the interview situation, as we know in psychology, is not ideal. People lie in interviews and people present the best, foot forward, and they'll say they can do everything and they promise the world, and they don't always live up to that. And even referees, I know it can be challenging to be a referee with someone that might have been a difficult person. And so then a referee will write, they worked here on this date, whatever, or they don't want to disclose the bad things in case they get in trouble for defaming them as well. So there are opportunities potentially for further information gathering. Is this the right way? Don't know. Great question though.
Thank you. Thank you also for the participant to ask such a good question. So the next question is from a person, Mr. Adam Haninditya. I hope it's a Mr. Hello, ma'am. I'm Adam. I'll ask you some question about data security and data breach. What can we do if our country or government doesn't provide good data security? And second, what can we do if our data has been breached? And what about your opinion about the inability of a government in maintaining the data security of its people? Respectfully. Thank you.
Oh man, that's a great question. And of course, we're all dealing with this very differently right now, aren't we? Now, I'm not a technical person, but what I can say about governments and protection is, I think and the Oxford, the Institute for Cybersecurity at Oxford has instigated a study. They started, gosh, a few years ago now. I was involved in some of that, looking about cybersecurity capacity across all nations. I'm not sure if they've sampled Indonesia yet. I know they've done the South Pacific. And so there's a few issues here. What level are governments at in terms of cybersecurity protection, but also what they can do technically, but also what they can do in terms of providing information for businesses and individuals. Now, there's a whole lot of scope there. Governments do try, and they may try to put out, information that might help individuals, that might help businesses, and also provide advice on what to do when you do have a security breach to prevent, what to do afterwards. I think, in my opinion, even if some of that advice is sound, it's not communicated very well to people. And why do I say that? That's because education is different than just writing a few words on a web page or a few nice pictures. It needs to be done effectively. And so that's looking at how to protect, but then the issue of when a breach happens, what do you do, right? Now, when I worked for the World Economic Forum for cybersecurity, looking at these issues, these questions were being asked. Do you reveal your cyber breach very quickly to the government and to other industries who may be affected? And that may be the ethical and the right thing to do to prevent further attacks to further organizations, but also others might be able to step in very quickly and provide support for those individuals. The other side of the argument is organizations don't want to reveal it because they think it's going to hurt their reputation. So some of the things we looked at with the World Economic Forum was, how do you reveal it in an ethical way while preserving your reputation as well? And so part of that is really how you respond to that, that data breach. But data breaches can be to organizations, they can be to individuals. It's a great question, and I think it warrants a whole nother keynote to address that wonderful question.
Thank you. And I think there's another question that might need a longer discussion, but maybe you could give a little of your view about this. And this, I think, is important for parents, especially with little kids, how to teach healthy social life through digital platforms to children.
I think that's a wonderful question. You know, when I was young, at least, you know, the issue was stranger danger, and that was communicated well. We still need to do that, but the problem is still that digital divide, right? That parents don't understand how technology works in order to be able to communicate that well to their kids. So it really is about who are the guardians for children. It's the parents to some extent, it's the schools as well. I think, you know, the schools and governments need to educate the parents a lot better to be able to understand what's going on, and also to motivate them, to help them be interested and invested in learning about this stuff. I actually think talking about these issues very early on is really important, including, you know, preschool, before school starts, talking about what is good communication. Like, you know, I've volunteered to do things with the preschools before they start going through emoticons and saying, if you got sent this, how would you feel? You know, just so they understand the repercussions of their communication in a very early stage, to know, you know, these things can be fun, but you need to do it in a healthy, ethical way, and making that conversation open as early as possible. I'm mindful that there's a lot of good work actually done in Singapore by the Singapore government, looking at education for kids as well. And so, and I know we looked at that for the World Economic Forum as well. And I think maybe sharing some of the tricks that work well is really important across our different countries and domains, because governments are trying to do it. I still don't think they're anywhere near being effective. They could talk to you guys more, you know, talking to academics, talking to the experts, and really opening up that conversation, and then us going about with our experimental methods and testing what works, because just like with everything else, what sounds intuitive isn't necessarily the case. But if we're looking at kids, we need to get that on early, and we need to understand what's happening for them, and also help them feel that they can approach you as a parent when things go wrong, or they're uncomfortable, they're unsure, and they can say, I've seen this, you know, tell me what you think. I felt bad about this, you know. So yeah, just as brief as I can to that wonderful question as well.
Yeah, I know it could be it needs like a more comprehensive looking into this topic, because it's such a broad topic. Yeah. Okay, next one, we have Mr. Seta Wicaksana. If Mr. Seta Wicaksana could unmute himself and probably ask the question. We'll wait for a few seconds. Okay, so then I'll read the question from Mr. Seta Wicaksana. Professor Whitty, how to maximize the benefit digital and technology to create health, personality, and relation in social media activities. Thank you, Professor.
Can you direct me to that one again? It was how to
how to maximize the benefit of digital and technology to create healthy personality and relationship in social media activities.
Oh, okay, great. Yes. So how do we actually develop that? How do we use that to our greater benefit, right? Yeah. Oh, gosh, I think it's all together with what I'm saying about norms and how we, develop those strengths. How do we define as acceptable and appropriate behavior? And, while we've got the kids learning this in schools, we have a whole other generations not having learnt this at schools, right? And not learning how to do these things well. And people develop relationships throughout their lives, especially these days. I think workplaces can do a better job there. In the workplace, CISOs and the like are moving towards developing cybersecurity for both the work and for personal use, right? Knowing that the people, especially now with COVID, are using their work devices for personal use. Now, they could stretch that program more to work with other policy developers about appropriate communications, developing healthy relationships. So that, I guess it's about where do we learn about these things to do it right, to do, the best tips in terms of good communications. Where else might we do this? Well, we talked about dating sites and people developing relationships on dating sites and other forums. On dating sites, they give you a bit of an inkling, that you might be approached by a criminal, and they give you some tips for dating, but they don't do it great. I think they could do it better. So it's at that point sometimes where you're actually using that technology. How do you learn to do that better? And you could expand that to other things like online shopping, etc. as well. So again, just doing that briefly, but they're really, really, really good questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Whitty, for the answer. And another one we already have from Mrs. Vinaya. If Mrs. Vinaya could please unmute herself to ask the question.
Hi, Prof. Whitty. I'm Naya. I would like to ask about what do you think about a hate speech in political context? Some institution or government have contribution to build troll or cyber troop to spread hate speech or fake news about the other party. What do you think about this from cybercrime perspective? Thank you.
Great question again too. Of course, fake news. Wow. Some of the things that I'm interested in fake news is not just about, and of course it's such a problem now with the vaccine and everything everywhere, right? As a good example, but it's also about what fake news is effective versus not effective. Where do we turn our attention to if we're going to filter out this information? When is it appropriate to filter it out, etc.? America gave us some good examples of, president thinking this is acceptable to spread fake news as much as possible and then call everything genuine fake news, right? So he really put it on the agenda as a problem that they didn't deal with well, and we still don't deal with it well also. But then, as you're saying, looking at trolling, there are people with political beliefs that want to push those really forward. And sometimes they do that truthfully, right? Truthfully, I believe blah, blah, blah. And there is some evidence about that. I think what makes fake news a problem is not just believability that I talked about, but also that there is palpering that happens. And what I mean by that, there's a mixture of truth and lies. And those are the harder ones to kind of separate. But also, I suspect, and there needs to be more research on that those are the ones that perhaps are more believable as well. Because when we look at lies and they're mixed with some truth, people, if they want to believe something, they'll focus on the bit that's the truth, and they use cognitive dissonance, right? And they focus on those issues. So it's a tricky one. If we're going to use technology to filter it out, I think that's useful. Looking at who the senders are, there's work around that. How we breach privacy to do that's really important. So where's the fine line, even in the art of the possible? But if we are to work out where do we focus, because there is so much of it out there, then we need to think about which parts of misinformation are the ones we really want to focus on. Is it political? Is it, causing harm to democracy? If that's it, is it about health? If it's going to cause harm to the health of a nation. So yeah, good question. And, misinformation was always here, was used by the Romans in terms of propaganda. And it's just, we can do it bigger and better now. And of course, there's a lot of good work by social scientists that can distinguish, by computer scientists, being able to distinguish a bot versus not. So you can eradicate a bot pretty quickly these days, but it's the other people that are pushing these bits out. Does that help answer that just a little bit?
Yeah,
thank you for a great question.
Yeah, if I could share a little bit of my knowledge about the US, how actually this is the first time ever that the president of the United States was banned in few social platform, which is very outrageous for a lot of people because this negates the freedom of speech they highly regard. Yeah. So yeah, I think this is a very interesting time.
Absolutely. Isn't it fascinating, right? As you say, this is their values that they uphold so strongly. And yet to do that to the person who's meant to be the most respected person in the country. And a lot of people believing all that stuff, it is really fascinating. And, if you're going to believe something beyond the message, in psychology, we know that there are other factors involved. And one of those factors is, if it's said by a person of authority, you're more likely to believe it. So if we recall back when President Trump was talking about COVID potential, way of dealing with it with bleach. I don't know if you all remember that. I don't think I'm ever going to forget that. And lights, stuff. And someone, and the doctor sitting there not being brave enough to stand up and say, don't put bleach down, you will kill you, giving a very disdained look, but knowing you don't challenge that person in power, right? And then afterwards, the news sites and everything else having to challenge that, because a lot of people will believe a president, because you should be able to believe a president, and then him standing against it saying, oh, it's just being sarcastic or something like that. But that it does become very dangerous, and then banning someone who is in that position in a country that values it. Isn't that fascinating, right? How did we get to that point? And maybe at some point, looking into a crystal ball, maybe this value of saying anything you want, being able to express your rights, maybe that's going to be challenged in that culture. Who knows? Our cultures never stay completely static. They do vary, and they vary for all sorts of reasons, right? As we develop, evolve, go forwards, go backwards. But yeah, definitely fascinating.
Yes, absolutely correct. Maybe we have time for one more question. Oh, sorry, 4 more questions. I just got the message from the committee. One comes from Mr. Sarojini Imran. If Mr. Sarojini Imran could please unmute himself.
Thank you for the time. Okay. Hello, Professor Whitty. Yes, I'm Jeannie. I'm a lecturer at the tourism faculty. I'm very interested in online communication, especially about trust. As we know, the tourism aspect has a considerable impact due to the COVID pandemic. But tourism businesses continue to promote and sell virtual tourism. My question is, how much influence a person's psychology has in the believing virtual images and awakening his desires, and whether the virtual image can be more powerful than online speech? Thank you.
Oh, that's a really wonderful question. I've not really thought about that before, the idea of how the virtual images might replace, our physical world experiences. And I guess it depends on how it's presented. It's interesting, and this is just going to be completely anecdotal rather than based on research, but in looking at people's experiences that I've known through COVID, some people have got upset when they see other people's images when they're going on holidays or, traveling, etc., going, I don't want to see that. I'm not experiencing that. I just see my four walls, and that's my reality, and I don't want anything to do with that. Whereas others have gone, this is really something I can enjoy in a vicarious way. So I can enjoy the world through other people's eyes, through their experiences, through I reckon, you know, you're right, there may be a way to experience this in a different way, but I think we have to get it right, you know, and I think this is where the psychology comes in. Well, just like Zoom, you know, it's constructed in the best way probably that they can. Maybe they can be doing things better, but we need to understand the norms of how our cognitions cope with this this world. In the same way that perhaps we could be thinking about, you know, virtual tourism as well. And actually, if I was a marketer, that might be something really important to explore. And you know why? Because we're not going to be traveling overseas for quite some time from some of our countries, right? If I was in the UK, I could go to Europe now, and I'd love to do that, especially being in the summer. But, you know, our government's really giving a clear message. You know, no one's coming here that can't come here, and you're not leaving this country for some time. So, and in this new world, you know, what are our new opportunities to experience? And if you've got research on that, and if you're exploring that, please tell me, and I'd love to learn more.
Thank you, Professor Whitty. I think what we also see a lot nowadays is communication through memes. So it's not really, you know, a lot of text, just pictures, but then it already says a lot. I think this is what nowadays a lot of young people, like not even young, probably even the more grown-ups. Yeah, I think this is a very interesting thing that you can just communicate through one page or one pictures.
Oh, it's so true, isn't it? It's and it's just so interesting because, you know, it goes back to that early days of research. Oh, the text, they won't get the real person out, and you know, people started to use emoticons very quickly. And of course, the internet wasn't even developed for personal usage, as people may know. You know, it was developed by the army to be able to send packets of information, and even in those early days, people found it as a social need, right? And so it exploded from there. So even while people are constructing things on a pragmatic level to be able to send information, people are going, yeah, but how do I do this to relate to people? And so memes are something else that's developed that is, you know, often it's got a lot of humor. And so it's going beyond the emoticon showing an expression, but trying to emote an expression as well, and relate in a way where, and again, this is so funny that in fact it was so hard, our bandwidth in the early days, where we had limited, you know, a time to be able to write something. Writing something took so long to send, you had to plug your modem in and everything else. And now we have all the bandwidth in the world, and a meme will do, right? So we kind of went, yeah, well, we got all this, but this is what we want to do. This is how we want to communicate. So yeah, it's brilliant. I just think it's absolutely brilliant. I wish I was alive in another 100 years and see where we are now with everything, but
yeah, that's true. So next question we have from actually a special person from Mr. Roni Adikarya, who's also a speaker in our next sessions. Mr. Roni Adikarya has a question here. Could you please unmute yourself?
Okay. Thank you, Professor Whitty. It was a very good exposure on a very important problem, but this aspect has not been discussed by many. And I'm glad you brought it to our attention today. Many have been talking in general about post-truth, issues about hate, fake, hoax, etc. And this afternoon, I'll be talking about one of the many preventive measures, and that is how can we use an old theory in social psychology that many of you may have already been exposed to, and that is the communication inoculation. Okay, so you need to not only have the COVID vaccine, but also today, this morning, the minister and the rector were talking about the mindset and getting the mindset properly attuned to the newest situation or even problems. Now, my question to you is, given the context that of my interest, the question is, given the increasing threat and widening practice that you have nicely mentioned about cyber crime, cyber bullying, cyber stalking, etc., what policy level, this is the first one, what policy level, also regulatory and legal framework, and the third level is the strategic operational mitigation suggestion that you have? Because first of all, we need to make sure that the regulators, the policymakers, decision makers understand this problem. They need to know something, they need to do something. We cannot just be doing guerrilla style, talking at the community level to do things. It won't work, right? We need to have the policies right. Then we need to have a strategy, to have a system in how to implement. And this is my second question. Whose responsibility is it to implement in the most practical way? At what level? So can you enlighten us on that? And also how to enforce it? Thank you.
Oh, those are fantastic questions. And you know what, we're still evolving with all this, right? In fact, I've got a late afternoon meeting with Home Affairs as a committee where we're talking about some of these things. And the good news is that at least they're listening to academics' views on developing policy and strategy around, this is around cybersecurity altogether. Whose responsibility is this? And I guess it depends on what we're looking at, right? There's a whole lot of different components to this. Let's just put business in there for a start, right? At the moment, there's been talk about regulation, there's been talk about responsibility, etc. And when you just talk about those things and say this is what should happen, perhaps people don't necessarily, or businesses don't necessarily act in that way, right? And so then there's the question of, then just what you've just said, what do we need to enforce then? What should our government enforce then for industry if we're looking at security by design, for instance, and that's going beyond perhaps the stalking stuff, but is it a tick box exercise? Is it something that you're giving an incentive for? Is it something that you actually punish someone for if you're not doing those things? And then you're looking at the platforms like Facebook, etc. Who can control these things? Who has a say in actually what they're permitted to do and what they're not permitted to do? And let's say, all right, now certain countries Australia tried to stand up to Facebook to some things, right, more recently, but even then, all right, let's say everyone goes, Facebook's no good, let's do something else. What else is there as the alternative when you hold the market already? So these are some of the problems, right? And they're gobbling up all the other companies as well. So I'm probably posing more questions than answers to this, but that responsibility is exactly right. And we do need to start acting a little bit more bravely in all this as well. So as academics, what can we do? Well, when policymakers, governments invite us to talk, or we look to them to talk, we should do that, right? And I know this has been a long day for me, and then I'm going into an afternoon talk with government. I just think that's our moral responsibility to give them our views, so that helps change things. And you look at their strategy pieces and you read it and pull it apart and go, man, we've got a lot of work to do here. And partly because people don't understand the psychology and all this. The human factor is really important in all of it, and how you curtail behaviors and how you push other good behaviors along the way. So I know that's probably not giving you a satisfactory answer. I think they're really good questions, and they're questions that I often have in my mind and things that we need to work better at. But the other way of doing these things too is using public forums where we can to actually talk about these issues. So, that might be white papers, but it might be, looking at forums in terms of webinars, etc., and pushing those thoughts out. But then we need to look at, all right, as academics, we can think about these things, but what about people that haven't got that voice, haven't got their education? How do we empower them? Some of the things we try at University of New South Wales is actually the institute that I'm the director of. We look at education as a really important piece of our institute, not just research. And we look at education not just for university students. We look at this as professional education, but also our duty of going out and volunteering and talking to people about cybersecurity, about protecting, about helping people, enable them, etc. So it probably doesn't answer all your questions there. And I'm sure your talk will give a much better answer to it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Roni Adikarya, for the question. I'm sorry, at the moment you're unmute. Would you like to unmute yourself for a little more comment?
I think a little bit more. Wait a minute. Okay, can you? I'm not given the permission.
No, you are now. You are unmute now.
I can hear you.
No? Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
we can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Just a little pointers. I think one intervention point that is very important, especially now we're talking about to deans and to rectors, there must be a curriculum reform that will include cyber crime, cyber education, cyber law in there. That's the first step, because we need the thinkers first. All right, then the next step will need to be special lobbying, special treatment for regulator, for legislator. I think that is the most important step. That is my 2 cents. Curriculum reform. That's the key. I
completely agree.
And getting it into the curriculum, because when we talk about William McGuire's concept of communication and coalition, it's like public health, preventing before you are sick.
Yes.
So you have the mental, aptitude to fight it, to counterattack all those coming, fake information. Okay.
Oh gosh,
all right.
yeah.
We'll talk more in the afternoon.
That's so important. And I must say, I'm just one person, but our institute has got over 100 members now. And the good news is that they let a psychologist develop an institute in cybersecurity. And we across every faculty at the university to look at this problem, to educate, and we're doing a mapping exercise at the moment to make sure that even our teaching across, even within our courses, appreciates the different disciplines. And we have a wonderful director of education, Richard Buckland, that as a special individual that's able to do that better than anyone I know, but and at the same time impact and bringing those academics together, doing these impactful activities. I completely agree with you, and I so want to learn about your work more and learn about you more too, and I'm so pleased to have met you right now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Roni Adikarya, for the question and comments, and also especially to Professor Monica Whitty for the brilliant presentations and knowledge sharing. I've been taking a lot of notes here. I'm sure everybody have a lot of things to ponder about from this presentation. So
thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, so next as a sign of gratitude and appreciation, and of course, hope for future collaboration, on behalf of Faculty of Psychology, Universitas Pancasila, I'd like to present you Certificate of Appreciation.
Thank you very much, that's lovely.
Thank you so much for being here with us. We cannot appreciate it more how comprehensive what you share with us today. Before I close the session, the Dean of Faculty of Psychology, Universitas Pancasila, would like to share something. Would like to have a few notes to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Pita. Good afternoon, Professor Monica. On behalf of the Faculty of Psychology, my name is Sony Suarso. As a Dean of the Faculty of Psychology, Universitas Pancasila, thank you very much for your speech, for your lecture for us. And I hope that we can work together further about joint research, maybe lecturer exchange and student exchange also, and general studium generally about cyber psychology. Thank you very much for your speech. But as you know, maybe before or after that, I want also to introduce to you about that Mrs. Pita, as a moderator, is the love daughter of our rector here, Rector Universitas Pancasila, Professor Editud Hendratno. So would you please, Professor Editud, want to say something to Professor Whitty? Would you please, Pak Rector? Thank you. Please unmute first. Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Professor Monica Whitty. I hear every word from you today, and very interesting, very inspiring. And even though it's new for me, but yeah, I think what Pak Dekan proposed to you, maybe someday visit to my faculty, my university, give a lecture, etc., can be considered, and then we can work together as a partner.
I would love that.
Win-win for us. Yeah.
And win-win for us too. That'd be absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. And Australia is not far from Jakarta.
I know, exactly. So very exciting. When can we travel?
Yeah. And also I think Pak Dekan also very happy if he can have time to go to New South Wales.
Okay.
You would be very welcome. You would be very welcome, all of you.
It's expectation. He is expert and a hobby. Jalan-jalan itu to go to.
Thank you.
I'm very glad today also that I can face the moderator because well, and because she is my daughter. Not from me, but 100% from the dean. So I just surprised today. That he chose my daughter as a moderator. Good job, Pita.
It was an excellent job.
Thank you very much, Pak Rektor. I think Pita is one of the best lecturer in our faculty, Prof. Whitty. So now he live in US, but in the next time, maybe she will move to German and come back to Indonesia also. So we hope that we work together, and yeah, we can contribute to both countries next time. Thank you, Pita. Good job. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Mas Sony. And of
thank
course,
you to everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Whitty. And before we end the session, to commemorate this lovely event, I'd like to ask all the participants to turn on their cameras so we can take picture together. Okay, if everyone is ready, on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Salam Pancasila.
Salam Pancasila.
Thank you, Prof. Monica. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You've been all wonderful. I really appreciate your time, and thank you for the invitation.
Once again for sharing your expertise on this wonderful session, Professor Whitty. And we're all looking forward to hearing more of your work in the future. Thank you to all the participants for participating and the committee for organizing the webinar. Hope to see you in the next sessions. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.